Nobody asked the paralegal to have an opinion in this room.
Actually, you'll want to check the timestamp before the hearing, not after.
Odessa Winters did not look up. She was the only black woman at the table and the only person being spoken over like furniture. 12 associates sat around the conference table at Ashford and Kessler, coffee going cold, a hearing 4 days out. She had said one sentence, that the search warrant on their client's car had expired 6 hours before police used it, and the room had gone very still. Voss picked up her note card between 2 fingers like it might be dirty. He read her handwriting aloud in a voice pitched for laughs. 2 associates obliged him. Voss said, "I'll check what I need to check." He set the card face down on the table, the way you set aside something you don't intend to look at again. Near the door, a young paralegal named Renee Alders lifted her phone an inch, just enough to catch the card before it slid under a stack of files. She didn't know yet why it mattered. She only knew it felt like something worth keeping. Odessa reached into the worn leather folio she carried everywhere, soft at the corners now, and closed it without a word. Warren Kessler said from the head of the table, "Ms. Winters types fast. Let's move on." Odessa folded her hands and watched the room the way she always did, corner to corner, door last. She had learned a long time ago that the loudest man in a room is rarely the one keeping score. 4 days later, in a courthouse 2 miles away, that card would be the only thing standing between an innocent man and a guilty verdict. Nobody in that conference room knew it yet. The folder stayed closed, and inside that silence, 6 hours disappeared. The meeting broke a few minutes after that, the way meetings do when nobody wants to be the one who says it's over. Chairs scraped back. Voss was already talking to another associate about lunch before he'd cleared the doorway. Kessler gathered his folder and didn't look at Odessa on his way out, which was its own kind of answer. She stayed behind to straighten the room. Nobody asked her to. She had just always done it. Cups gathered onto a tray, chairs squared to the table, the whiteboard wiped clean of someone else's handwriting. It took 4 minutes. It gave her 4 minutes alone with the room before the next thing started, and she had learned a long time ago to value 4 minutes alone with a room. Odessa Winters had worked at Ashford and Kessler for 19 years. Before that, a smaller firm across town for 11. 30 years if anyone had ever bothered to add it up out loud, which nobody had. She arrived at 7 every morning, before the coffee machine had finished its first pot, before the receptionist unlocked the front door. She liked the building empty. She liked walking the hallway when it was just her footsteps on the carpet, checking that the conference rooms were set the way they needed to be set, that the exits weren't blocked, that nothing was out of place before 8 other people came in and rearranged the day around themselves. It wasn't a job requirement. It was a habit so old she couldn't remember choosing it, only that she had once, a long time ago in a different building, and never stopped. That morning, before the meeting where Voss had picked up her note card like it might be dirty, she'd walked in and found a new paralegal, Renee Alders, 2 years in, still nervous around the partners, standing frozen at the intake desk with a client who'd shown up 40 minutes early and furious about a delay nobody had explained to him. Odessa didn't rush. She poured the man a coffee he hadn't asked for, sat down across from him, and asked about his daughter, whose name was on the folder in his lap. By the time Renee had found the right file, the man was calm enough to laugh at something Odessa said. Renee never forgot that. She didn't say so. She just started watching Odessa a little more carefully after that. It wasn't the only kindness that went unremarked. It was simply the kind Odessa was used to giving without expecting anyone to notice, because for 30 years, mostly, nobody had. The small cuts came often enough that she'd stopped counting them individually, only the shape they made together. An associate had handed her his dry cleaning ticket the week before, assuming, without checking, that handing things to Odessa was the same as handing things to whoever answered to assistant. Kessler introduced her to a new client once as part of our support team, the way you'd introduce a photocopier that happened to be reliable. Voss, in his first 2 weeks at the firm, hadn't learned her name. He'd called her the paralegal 3 times in one meeting before Renee quietly corrected him once, and he still hadn't fully absorbed it by the day he read her note aloud for a laugh. Odessa didn't correct people anymore. She used to. A long time ago, in a different city, at a different firm, she had corrected a man once. A partner, gray at the temples, the kind of confident that comes from never once being told no. And he had looked at her for a long moment and said the firm didn't have room at the table for a woman like her. She'd been young enough then to think that was the end of an argument instead of the whole shape of one. She didn't argue anymore. She simply watched and remembered and kept things carefully in order, because order was the one thing nobody could take credit for or take away. She carried a leather folio everywhere, soft now at the corners, the color worn down to a deep, dull red from 30 years of hands. Inside it were her notes, page after page in the same tight, careful handwriting, dated in the corner the way she'd always done, out of habit more than anything else. She never explained the habit to anyone who asked, and hardly anyone ever asked. That evening, after the office had emptied out, Renee found her still at her desk, folio open, working through the Boykins file line by line for a case that officially belonged to somebody else. "You didn't have to keep looking at that," Renee said. "It's not your case." "It's somebody's case," Odessa said without looking up. "That's enough." Renee hesitated at the doorway a moment longer than she needed to, the photograph she'd taken that morning still sitting unopened in her phone. And then she said goodnight and left Odessa there, alone with the folio, and 4 days left before the hearing that would decide whether any of it mattered at all. The next morning, Kessler made it official. Voss would first chair the Boykins suppression motion. It was his first real case at the firm, the kind of assignment meant to prove something, and everyone in the room understood that the proving mattered more to Kessler than the winning did. Odessa had already read the file twice. She'd found the problem on the first pass and confirmed it on the second. The search warrant authorizing the vehicle search had a timestamp on it, and the search log filed by the arresting officers had a different one. 6 hours apart. Not a rounding error, not a typo. A gap wide enough that the warrant had technically expired before anyone used it. She wrote it down the way she wrote everything down, dated in the corner of a page in her folio, and gave Voss a copy before the assignment meeting even ended. "You'll want to look at the timestamps before you file anything," Odessa said. "The warrant and the search log don't match." Voss barely glanced at the page. "Somebody probably just wrote the wrong time on one of these things," he said. "Cops do that. It's not a real issue." "It might be the whole issue," Odessa said. "That's why I flagged it." "I've got this," Voss said. "You don't need to keep double-checking my work." He said it lightly, like a joke between colleagues, but it landed the way those things always landed, as a door closing. Odessa didn't push. She simply said the record should reflect that the discrepancy had been raised and left it at that. Renee, sitting near the back of the room with a legal pad she hadn't written on, spoke up before she could stop herself. "Maybe we could just verify it against the original log," she said. "Before the filing goes in, it wouldn't take long." Voss didn't look at her. "It's handled," he said. Nobody in the room asked what handled meant exactly. That was the trouble with the word. It sounded like an answer even when it wasn't one. Kessler, who had been half listening while reading something on his phone, glanced up only long enough to close the conversation the way he closed most conversations that made him uncomfortable. "Let the associate run his own case," he said. "That's what first chair means." Odessa gathered her folio and said nothing else. She had learned, a long time ago, which battles were worth the room's attention and which ones simply needed to be written down and dated for later. This one, she decided, belonged on paper. 4 days became 3. Voss filed his motion late Thursday afternoon, and Odessa read it that evening at her desk, alone, the way she read everything important. Twice, slowly, with a pen in hand. His filing didn't mention the timestamp discrepancy at all, not a footnote, not a passing reference. It was as if her note had never reached him, though she had the email to prove that it had, sent and time-stamped 3 weeks earlier, sitting quietly in the firm's own system. She didn't confront him about it the next morning. She asked him one question in the hallway. in a voice pitched low enough that it wasn't a performance for anyone watching. "Did you get a chance to verify the timeline before you filed?" Odessa asked. "I looked at it," Voss said. "It's not going to move the needle. Judges don't care about clerical stuff like that." "It's not clerical," Odessa said. "It's the difference between a valid search and an invalid one." Voss's jaw tightened, just slightly, the way it does when someone hears something they've already decided not to believe. "I appreciate the input," he said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "But I've got the case." He walked off before she could say anything else, which was, in its own way, an answer too. That afternoon, the write-up appeared in her file, not his, hers. A short note from Nora Fitch in compliance, citing a general professionalism concern. An associate had reported that a paralegal had repeatedly pressed her opinion on a case assignment after being asked to stop. No mention of a warrant, no mention of a timestamp. Just the shape of a complaint, vague enough to mean almost anything, specific enough to sit permanently in a personnel record. Odessa read it once, folded it, and placed it inside her folio next to the original note with the timestamp on it. The receipt Voss had never once verified, sitting now beside the report that had been written instead of the correction that should have been. She didn't say a word about it to anyone that day, but somewhere on the other side of town, in a filing that would be reviewed by people none of them had met yet, the 6-hour gap she'd flagged was still sitting exactly where she'd left it, waiting for someone with the authority to finally ask the right question. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock Monday morning, and by 8:30 the hallway outside courtroom 4 had already filled with more people than the Boykins case would normally draw. A local reporter had picked up the story the week before. A young man, a search that might not have held up, a public defender's office that had quietly asked Ashford and Kessler to take the case pro bono for the visibility. Visibility was exactly what it got. Odessa arrived early, the way she always did, folio under her arm, and found a bench near the wall where she could see both the courtroom doors and the hallway's only exit. She didn't sit with Voss and Kessler, she never had. She simply stood close enough to be useful if anyone asked, which, so far, nobody had. That was when Priscilla Ainsworth spotted her. Priscilla was a long-time client of the firm, the kind whose name appeared on donor plaques in buildings she'd never worked in, and she was waiting for an unrelated matter 2 courtrooms down. She recognized Kessler first, air-kissed him from a distance, and then her eyes landed on Odessa standing quietly by the wall. "Warren," Priscilla said, loud enough for the hallway to hear, "why is your file clerk standing with counsel? Is that normal now?" Kessler laughed, the kind of laugh that agrees with everyone at once and commits to nothing. "She helps keep us organized," he said, which was true and also, somehow, exactly the wrong thing to say. A few heads turned. A man near the vending machine lifted his phone, filming without really understanding what he was filming, and later that clip would circulate online captioned with a guess about courthouse drama that had nothing to do with what actually happened. Nobody in the hallway knew about the 6-hour gap between a warrant and a search log. They only saw an older black woman being spoken about instead of spoken to, and most of them decided, without meaning to decide anything at all, that it wasn't their business to say so out loud. Renee stood a few feet away, holding a stack of files she didn't need to be holding, and felt the specific shame of watching something wrong happen in a room full of people who could have said something. She opened her mouth once. Nothing came out. She closed it again. Odessa didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at Priscilla at all, in fact. She looked at Kessler. "If we're discussing the case," Odessa said, "we should keep it to case specifics. There are things in this file that matter more than where I'm standing." "Of course," Kessler said quickly, already moving Priscilla along with a hand at her elbow, eager to end a conversation he hadn't wanted to have in a public hallway. "We should get inside." Voss, a few feet away, said nothing to defend her. He didn't look at Odessa either. He checked his phone, straightened his jacket, and put a careful few steps of distance between himself and the woman whose note he still hadn't verified. The hallway noise resumed a moment later, the way it always does, as if nothing had happened at all. But Odessa had already opened her folio, just enough to glance at the page with the timestamp on it. The receipt nobody in that hallway had asked to see, still sitting exactly where she'd left it 3 weeks earlier, dated and waiting. 9 o'clock came. The courtroom doors opened. Nobody outside them yet understood what they were about to walk into. The courtroom doors opened at 9, and the case was called in the flat, procedural rhythm all cases are called in. Docket number, parties, appearances for the record. Voss stood when it was his turn and said his name for the transcript. Odessa was not asked to state anything. She sat one row behind the counsel table, folio closed on her lap, because that was where paralegals sat, and nobody in that room saw a reason to question it. The morning went the way Odessa had expected it would. Voss argued the motion he'd filed, the one that never mentioned the 6-hour gap between the warrant and the search log, and the prosecutor answered him point for point with the confidence of someone facing an argument that hadn't given her anything to worry about. It was over in under 20 minutes. The court set a continuance date and moved to the next matter, and Voss walked out of the courtroom already talking about it as a fine first outing, a warm-up, nothing that couldn't be fixed later. Nobody asked Odessa what she thought. She hadn't offered it. By early afternoon back at the firm, the version of the morning that reached Warren Kessler's office had very little to do with the morning Odessa had actually witnessed. There was a moment in the hallway, Voss said, standing in the doorway of Kessler's office. Before we went in, Ms. Winters got into it with a client in front of half the courthouse. Made a scene. She what? Kessler said. She was lecturing Priscilla Ainsworth, Voss said, in front of a reporter. It was embarrassing, honestly. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't want to make it worse. It was, Odessa would learn later, a story built almost entirely out of omission. It left out that Priscilla had spoken first. It left out what Priscilla had called her. It left out that Odessa had said 4 sentences, quietly, and every one of them had been about keeping the conversation to the case. What was left, once all of that was removed, was a shape that looked like a paralegal losing her composure in public, and that shape was much easier for Kessler to be angry about than the truth would have been. I'll have Nora look into it, Kessler said. Nora Fitch, the firm's compliance director, was brought in that same afternoon. She didn't ask Odessa what had happened. She asked Voss, and she asked Kessler, and she wrote what they told her. Renee heard about the write-up before Odessa did, the way news like that always seemed to travel sideways through a firm before it reached the person it was actually about. She sat with it for most of the afternoon, turning it over, remembering exactly what she'd watched in that hallway. Priscilla's voice, Kessler's laugh, Odessa's 4 calm sentences. And none of it matched what people were now repeating in the break room as fact. She almost said something to Fitch's assistant when she passed her in the hallway. She got as far as opening her mouth. "Everything okay?" the assistant asked. "Fine," Renee said, and kept walking, the photograph from 4 days earlier still sitting untouched on her phone, and the weight of not saying anything sitting a little heavier in her chest than it had the day before. By the end of the day, the story the firm believed had nothing to do with a warrant or a timestamp or a gap of 6 hours nobody official had yet bothered to check. Odessa found out about the write-up the way most people find out about the worst things said about them, secondhand and already finished. Nora Fitch called her into a small conference room on Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after the hearing, and slid a single printed page across the table. "This is a formal note for your file," Fitch said, "regarding the incident outside courtroom 4. Odessa read it once, slowly, the way she read everything. It described a paralegal who had engaged inappropriately with a firm client and raised her voice in a public setting, resulting in reputational concern for the firm. Nowhere on the page was a mention of what Priscilla Ainsworth had said first. Nowhere was a mention of the 4 sentences Odessa had actually spoken, or the fact that not one of them had been raised above a normal speaking voice. "I didn't raise my voice," Odessa said, "and I didn't approach Mrs. Ainsworth. She approached the conversation. I don't recall being asked what actually happened before this was written." The write-up reflects what was reported to me, Fitch said. Reported by whom? Odessa asked. Fitch hesitated just slightly. By people who were present, she said. I was present, Odessa said. I wasn't asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, stated plainly. The kind of sentence that didn't require raising anything at all to land the way it landed. Fitch didn't have an answer for it, so she moved instead to the part of the conversation she'd clearly prepared for. I need you to sign this, acknowledging the note, Fitch said. And going forward, we'd like you to limit direct interaction with clients in courthouse settings. Odessa didn't sign it. I'll acknowledge that I received it, she said. I won't sign language that isn't accurate. If the record's going to exist, it should reflect what actually happened, not what was reported without asking the person it's about. Fitch wrote something down, unhappy, and let the meeting end there. What Odessa didn't know yet, what nobody in that room knew yet, was that a separate, smaller problem had already begun forming a floor below, in the firm's records department, where a man named Curtis Boone had been quietly asked by Kessler's assistant to streamline the Boykins file before anything else gets attached to it. Boone didn't ask what that meant exactly. He simply understood it as a request to make certain entries less visible than others, and he began moving things around in the shared drive that afternoon, the kind of small administrative decision that rarely gets noticed until someone goes looking for what used to be there. Renee noticed something smaller, but it stayed with her. She'd been asked to help update the case timeline for the file, a routine task, and had pulled up an internal email chain to reference a date, Odessa's original email, sent 3 weeks before the hearing, the one that laid out the timestamp discrepancy in full. It was still there, untouched, dated exactly when Odessa had said it was. She stared at it a long moment, then closed the window without saying anything to anyone, the way she'd stayed quiet in the hallway, the way she'd stayed quiet in the break room. But this time, before closing it, she forwarded a copy to her personal account, quietly, without telling herself exactly why. It wasn't courage yet. It was closer to instinct. But instinct sometimes is where courage starts. The continuance hearing landed the following Monday, and this time Kessler wanted the whole team present for the re-argument. Voss at counsel table, Odessa a row behind him, Renee near the back with the files. The timestamp issue still hadn't made it into any filing. Odessa had said nothing more about it since Fitch's office. She had simply kept the folio close, the way she always did, and waited to see whether anyone would ever ask the right question without her having to force it. She never got the chance to find out that day. Voss, rattled by a sharper set of questions from the bench than he'd expected, stepped out into the hallway during a short recess to collect himself. Odessa followed a few paces behind, folio under her arm, intending only to hand him a printed copy of the search log in case the judge asked for it again. She held it out to him. "You'll want this," Odessa said, "in case it comes up." Voss didn't take it. He looked past her at the courthouse security officer stationed near the doors, and something in his face changed. Not confusion this time, but the particular panic of a man who needed someone else to be the problem. "She's not supposed to be back here," Voss said to the officer, loud enough for the hallway to hear. "She's not authorized for counsel access." It wasn't true, and it wasn't even close to true, but it was said with enough confidence that the officer didn't pause to check. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Doyle, stepped forward and took Odessa gently but firmly by the elbow. "Ma'am, I need you to step back through security," Doyle said. "I've been badged into this courthouse for the entire hearing," Odessa said, calm, not raising her voice, not pulling away. "You're welcome to check the log." "I need you to come with me," Doyle said again, already moving her toward the checkpoint, following an instruction he had no reason yet to question. She didn't resist. She let herself be walked the short distance to the security desk, the folio still under her arm, her face giving away nothing beyond the same watchfulness it always carried. At the tray, an officer reached for the folio itself, meaning to set it aside with her bag for inspection. That was the moment Renee finally moved. She'd seen the whole thing from the hallway, the same freeze rising in her chest that had kept her silent in front of Priscilla Ainsworth and silent in the break room. But this time, Her feet carried her forward before her mind finished deciding anything. "That's hers," Renee said, stepping in and lifting the folio herself before it reached the tray. "I've got it. I'll hold it for her." Nobody stopped her. Nobody seemed entirely sure in that moment who was actually in charge of anything. Odessa said only one thing before she was walked further from the courtroom, and she said it evenly, without heat, the way she said everything that mattered. "Please log the time," Odessa said, "and my name." Doyle didn't answer her. He simply kept walking, following an order that had started as one man's lie and was now, whether anyone intended it or not, becoming something written down. By the time the recess ended, Odessa was standing outside the courthouse doors, no longer inside the building where the case that mattered most to her was still being argued without her. A mistake had just become a record, and nobody yet knew how far that record would travel. Odessa waited outside the courthouse for nearly an hour before the recess ended and someone finally came looking for her. It wasn't Voss. It wasn't Kessler. It was Renee, folio still in her arms, moving fast down the front steps like she'd been holding her breath the whole time she searched. "I've got it," Renee said, holding the folio out with both hands, the way you return something you understand now is worth more than you first realized. "I didn't let them take it." "Thank you," Odessa said, and took it back gently, checking nothing inside had been disturbed, the same quiet habit she brought to everything. Renee didn't leave. She stood there a moment, working something loose in her chest that had been stuck there for days. "There's more," she said. "I should have said something sooner. I didn't." She took out her phone and, for the first time, actually showed Odessa what she'd been carrying since the first morning in the conference room. The photograph of the note Voss had mocked, time-stamped from that day, still perfectly legible. Then the email, forwarded to her own account 2 days earlier, the one Odessa had sent 3 weeks before the hearing, laying out the 6-hour gap between the warrant and the search log in her own words, dated and unmistakable. "I kept them," Renee said. "I didn't know why exactly. I just didn't want them to disappear." Odessa looked at the screen for a long moment, and something in her posture changed slightly. Not relief exactly, but the specific stillness of someone finally seeing a shape she'd suspected was forming all along. "You did the right thing," she said. "Keep both of those exactly where they are. Don't edit them. Don't forward them anywhere else yet." "What do I do with them?" Renee asked. "Nothing for now," Odessa said. "Just don't let them get lost." Nearby, a courthouse deputy finishing his own paperwork glanced over at the two of them and, almost as an afterthought, made a note in the sign-in log. The time Odessa had been removed, the reason given at the checkpoint, her name spelled correctly because she had asked him herself to spell it correctly before he wrote it down. It was a small entry, the kind that exists in 100 courthouses every day and means nothing to almost anyone who reads it. But it now sat in the same official record as the search warrant timestamp, the search log, and the motion Voss had filed without either one. None of it added up to anything yet, not officially. It was a photograph on a phone, an old email nobody at the firm had bothered to reread, and a handwritten line in a security log. Separately, each piece looked like nothing worth mentioning. But Odessa had learned a long time ago that most things that eventually mattered had started out looking like nothing worth mentioning. She closed her folio, tucked it under her arm the way she always did, and looked back toward the courthouse doors she was no longer allowed to walk through that day. "We wait," Odessa said, "and we keep everything exactly as it is." The contradiction surfaced 2 days later, and it didn't come from anyone trying to find it. It came from a court clerk named Patricia Loomis, whose only job that morning was to reconcile the week's filings before they were formally entered into the docket. Loomis had pulled the Boykins file to confirm a hearing date when she noticed something that didn't sit right. The motion Voss had filed carried a submission timestamp of Thursday afternoon, but the firm's own case management system, visible to her only because the court had requested a courtesy copy of the internal filing log as part of a routine audit, showed an earlier draft touching the file weeks before that, then nothing again until 2 days before the hearing. A gap sat in the middle of it, unexplained, the kind of blank space that usually meant nothing and occasionally meant everything. She mentioned it almost in passing to a colleague who happened to know someone at Ashford and Kessler. That colleague mentioned it to Nora Fitch, framing it only as a scheduling question. But Fitch, already sensitive about the personnel note she'd written days earlier, reacted to it as something closer to a threat. "There's a question about a gap in the file history," Fitch said, standing in Kessler's doorway. "I don't think it's anything, but I wanted you to know before anyone else asks." "Handle it quietly," Kessler said. "We don't need this turning into something bigger than it is." What neither of them yet understood was that the gap existed because Curtis Boone, following an instruction he'd never questioned closely enough, had moved several internal file entries out of the active folder the week before, including, without his fully realizing it, a version of the record that still referenced Odessa's original timestamp email. He hadn't deleted anything. He'd simply relocated it somewhere less visible, the kind of shortcut that looks harmless until someone official goes looking for exactly what used to be there. Fitch called Odessa in again that same afternoon, this time with a different document in front of her. A proposed statement, already drafted, meant for Odessa to sign, characterizing the courthouse removal as a misunderstanding resolved amicably, with no reference to Voss's false claim to security. "We'd like to close this out cleanly," Fitch said, sliding it across the table. "If you sign this, it stays a personnel matter, nothing more." Odessa read it once. "This says I was escorted out due to a miscommunication," she said. "I wasn't. I was reported as unauthorized, and that report wasn't true. I won't sign something that isn't accurate." "It would make things simpler," Fitch said. "Simple isn't the same as true," Odessa said. "I'll give a statement. It'll say what actually happened, in the order it happened. That's the only version I'll sign my name to." Fitch didn't push further that day. She took the unsigned page back, along with the growing, uncomfortable sense that the story she'd been handed no longer matched whatever was sitting quietly in a record somewhere, waiting for the right person to notice it. Somewhere in that gap between what was filed and what was true, a review hearing was already moving faster than Kessler expected, and for the first time, every version of the story would have to sit in the same room. The hearing that finally forced everything into one room was not the suppression motion itself. It was a compliance review, called after the courthouse's own filing office flagged the gap Patricia Loomis had found, and after the public defender's office, hearing whispers of irregularities, requested the court examine the record before proceeding further. Judge Everett Marsh, who had presided over the original hearing and the continuance, agreed to hear it himself rather than pass it to another department. He wanted, he said simply, to understand his own docket. The room was smaller than a courtroom, more like a hearing chamber, with a long table instead of a bench, though Judge Marsh still sat at the head of it, robe set aside, reading glasses low on his nose. Kessler sat with Voss on one side. Nora Fitch sat beside them, a folder of her own in front of her. Odessa sat across the table, folio in her lap. Renee a few seats down, and Marcus Doyle waiting near the door in case his account of the removal was needed. Kessler spoke first, the way managing partners generally do, smoothing the room before anyone else could shape it. "Your Honor, I want to be clear this was, at its heart, a personnel matter that got tangled up with a case timeline," Kessler said. "A miscommunication in a busy office, nothing that should reflect on the underlying motion." "I'd like to understand the timeline before I decide what it reflects on," Judge Marsh said. "Let's start with the filing gap." The court clerk's office had already submitted its findings in writing, and Judge Marsh had them in front of him. The original internal email, still intact, time-stamped 3 weeks before the hearing, followed by a gap of nearly 2 weeks in the firm's own file history, followed by the final motion, filed without once referencing the issue raised in that first email. "Mr. Voss," Judge Marsh said, "you're listed as the recipient of an email dated 3 weeks prior to your motion, describing a discrepancy between a warrant timestamp and a search log timestamp. Did you receive that email?" "I received a lot of correspondence on that case," Voss said. I don't recall every line of every message. This one specifically flagged a 6-hour gap in the timeline that would bear directly on the validity of the search, Judge Marsh said. Did you investigate it? I made a judgment call that it wasn't significant, Voss said. Based on what? Judge Marsh asked. Voss didn't have an answer that filled the silence that followed. It was Renee, seated further down the table, who spoke next, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. I preserved that email, Renee said. I forwarded it to my personal account the same week the gap appeared in the file system because I noticed it hadn't been acted on. I also have a photograph of the original handwritten note from the day it was first raised, in a meeting where it was read aloud and dismissed. Judge Marsh looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. I'll want copies of both, with your account of when and how they were preserved entered into today's record, he said. Renee did not hand over screenshots first. She handed over the phone. The clerk connected it to the court's evidence laptop, exported the original image file, and noted the metadata on the record. The date matched the conference room meeting. The time matched the moment Voss had lifted Odessa's note card for the room to laugh at. Then Renee opened the forwarded email from her personal account. The header showed the original sender, the original recipient, and the date Odessa had warned Voss about the 6-hour gap. Judge Marsh did not call it proof yet. He called it what it was, a preserved record. Nora Fitch tried once to shape the room back toward her original framing. Your Honor, if I may, this appears to be at most an internal disagreement about workplace conduct that's being conflated with the merits of the case, Fitch said. I'm not here to referee workplace conduct, Judge Marsh said. I'm here because a filing in front of me may have omitted a fact material to a client's liberty. Those are different questions, and I intend to answer the second one first. He turned, finally, to Odessa herself, who had said nothing yet. Ms. Winters, Judge Marsh said, I understand you're the one who originally identified this discrepancy. I am, Odessa said. He studied her for a moment longer than the question required, the way a man does when something familiar sits just out of reach. He said nothing more about it yet. He simply asked the court reporter to note, for the record, that the original note referenced in testimony was still in the physical possession of the person who wrote it. The court reporter, an older woman who had worked that courthouse for the better part of 2 decades, glanced toward Odessa with something that looked briefly like recognition, and addressed her only as she wrote. Ms. Winters, the reporter said quietly, would you like water while we wait? It was a small kindness. It was also, Odessa noticed, offered with a level of care that didn't quite match the room she was supposedly sitting in. Odessa took the water when it was offered, said thank you quietly, and set the glass aside without drinking from it. The room settled again into the low hum of a hearing waiting for its next thread to be pulled. Judge Marsh looked down at his notes for a long moment, then back up at her. Ms. Winters, Judge Marsh said, you testified that you identified the timestamp discrepancy and documented it in writing at the time. I'd like to see that original note, not a copy, the one you wrote yourself. Odessa opened her folio. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Not the ordinary quiet of people waiting their turn, but the specific stillness of a room realizing something is about to be decided in it. She turned to the page, dated in the corner in the same tight handwriting she'd used for 30 years, and slid the folio across the table. Judge Marsh read it in silence. He read the date twice. Then he looked at the page a while longer than reading it required, and something in his expression shifted, slow and deliberate, like a man matching a shape to a memory he hadn't expected to need again. Judge Marsh did not speak for several seconds. Then he turned the folio slightly, not toward Kessler, not toward Voss, but toward the clerk. The author of this legal analysis has been treated in the record as support staff, Judge Marsh said. Before I decide what that means for this filing, I want the author's professional status checked on the record. Kessler's hand moved once on the table. Voss stopped looking at the page. Judge Marsh looked at Odessa. Ms. Winters, Judge Marsh said, state your full legal name for the record. Odessa Marie Winters, she said. Is that the name under which the state bar should search its registry? Judge Marsh asked. The room did not move. Yes, Odessa said. I was admitted 31 years ago. My license is active. Odessa Marie Winters, the clerk said. Admitted to the state bar 31 years ago. License active and in good standing. No disciplinary history on file with this jurisdiction. Kessler's chair creaked, faintly, as he shifted forward. Voss said nothing at all, his face doing the slow arithmetic of every sentence he'd spoken in that building over the past 3 weeks. Judge Marsh turned to the clerk seated beside him. Pull the State Bar Registry, he said. Live on the record, please. It took less than a minute. The clerk read the result aloud, plainly, the way clerks read anything into a record. No drama in her voice, only fact. Odessa Marie Winters, the clerk said. Admitted to the state bar 31 years ago. License active and in good standing. No disciplinary history on file with this jurisdiction. Judge Marsh set the folio down gently, as if it had become, in that moment, something closer to evidence than a notebook. Ms. Winters, he said, you have held an active law license this entire time. I have, Odessa said. And you have been working at this firm as a paralegal. I have, she said, for 19 years. Before that, 11 years at another firm in a different role, for reasons that are mine and not relevant to this record. She said it without heat, without apology, and without asking for anything. It was simply a fact laid down next to the other facts already on the table, the way she had laid down every fact in this story from the very first page of her folio. I want to be clear about something, Odessa said, since it matters more than my history does. I identified the discrepancy because it was in the file, and it mattered to a man's liberty, not because of anything else about who I am. That would have been true if I'd never passed a bar exam in my life. Judge Marsh nodded slowly. Noted, he said, and appreciated. That was the part the room had to understand. The license did not make Odessa right. The file did. The bar record did not create her value. It only proved how long the room had been refusing to see it. He turned back to Kessler, whose face had gone very still in the particular way of a man recalculating everything his firm had built on top of a fact he'd never once bothered to ask about. Mr. Kessler, Judge Marsh said, I'll want a full accounting from your office of how a licensed attorney came to be listed and treated for 19 years exclusively as support staff, and whether that fact was ever accurately represented to any court, including this one. Your Honor, Kessler started. That's not a question for today, Judge Marsh said. It's a referral. I'm ordering a preservation directive on all internal records related to the Boykins matter, effective immediately. And I'm referring the personnel and disclosure questions to the appropriate bar review. And I want the records employee who moved those file entries identified by close of business, Judge Marsh said. Not punished in this room, identified. The record needs to know whose hands touched the file and who told him to touch it. As for the motion in front of me, the discrepancy Ms. Winters identified 3 weeks before it was ever filed is material, and it will be addressed on its merits at the next session. He looked once more at Voss. Mr. Voss, Judge Marsh said, you'll want to prepare a fuller account of what you did and didn't do with that information. This court will hear it. Voss said nothing. There was nothing yet to say that wouldn't make things worse. The room did not erupt. Nobody clapped. Nobody was arrested. It simply sat there, reordered, the way a room sits differently once one fact in it has changed everything else around it. Odessa closed her folio, gathered it under her arm the way she always had, and said nothing further unless asked. She had gotten exactly what she had asked for from the very beginning. Not credit, not apology, only the record reflecting what was true. The suppression hearing reconvened 11 days later, and this time there was no confusion about who would be presenting the argument. Judge Marsh had made clear the discrepancy Odessa identified would be addressed on its merits, and it was Odessa herself, appearing now with formal leave of the court, who walked the record through the 6-hour gap one final time. The warrant, the search log, the camera system that had never been reset. It took less than 15 minutes. The motion to suppress was granted. 2 weeks after that, the charges against Terrence Boykins were dismissed outright. He was 22 years old, and when his mother found Odessa in the hallway afterward, she didn't say anything about bar numbers or licenses. She just held both of Odessa's hands in hers and said, "Thank you for seeing him." And Odessa, who had spent 30 years learning not to accept praise she felt she hadn't fully earned, let herself simply say, "He deserved to be seen." Back at the firm, nothing resolved as cleanly. Bradley Voss was placed on administrative suspension, pending the bar's disciplinary review into his handling of the original email, a process that would take months and might end in nothing more than a formal reprimand, or might end in something heavier. Nobody yet knew, and the not knowing sat over the office like weather. Warren Kessler faced a separate bar referral, focused on 19 years of describing a licensed attorney to clients and courts as support staff while benefiting from her legal analysis. The Bar Association had not reached a conclusion. That was the point. For the first time, Kessler was the one waiting for a record he could not control. Nora Fitch was removed from employee discipline intake while the firm reviewed how she had written a formal personnel note without interviewing the person it accused. Later, she was ordered to rewrite the compliance procedure she had once used as a shield, so no future note could enter a personnel file without the accused employee's statement attached. She did it without complaint, and without once, in Odessa's hearing, offering an apology that sounded like more than paperwork. The firm announced, 3 weeks later, a new internal policy requiring that any legal analysis performed by paralegal staff be credited by name and dated in the official case file going forward. Priscilla Ainsworth's name never appeared in the public order. But the hallway clip did reach the firm's client committee, and for the first time in years, someone wrote down that a client's money did not give her permission to humiliate staff in a courthouse hallway. It was framed in the internal memo as a routine update to documentation standards. Everyone who'd sat in that hearing room knew exactly what had actually prompted it. Renee stayed on at the firm. She was quieter than before in a way that read less like fear now and more like someone getting comfortable holding weight she hadn't expected to carry. One afternoon, cleaning out an old drawer, she found the photograph she'd taken back in the conference room, still saved, still dated, and sat with it a long moment before closing her phone. "I keep thinking about how long I almost didn't say anything," Renee told Odessa, the two of them alone in the break room. "I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't." "You said something," Odessa said. "That's the part that matters now." Odessa took her folio home that evening the way she always did, except this time, when the firm's office manager offered to have it properly archived as part of the file record, she declined. "It's mine," she said simply, and nobody argued the point. She set it on the kitchen table beside the mail she hadn't gotten to yet, and that was when she noticed the envelope near the bottom of the stack. Thick, official, forwarded twice, the return address belonging to the State Bar Association in the city where she'd been admitted 31 years earlier. She hadn't requested anything from them in over a decade. She opened it slowly. Inside was a partial copy of her original personnel file from the firm she'd left all those years ago, released in response to an inquiry she'd filed and mostly forgotten she'd ever sent. Most of the pages were exactly what she remembered. One page was not. A single paragraph, near the bottom, had been blacked out entirely, redacted so completely that even the shape of the sentence beneath it had disappeared. She sat with that page a long time, the folio closed beside it, 31 years of paper suddenly feeling like it had never quite finished being written. She didn't call anyone that night. She simply set the letter down, the redacted line still facing up, and turned off the kitchen light. If you've ever been ignored by a room that needed your work but not your name, you know what that silence costs. And if you've ever watched someone else get erased and said nothing, then ask yourself the question Renee had to ask. When the record finally opens, which side of it will your silence be on?